Okay. So to start, I thought we could start with a round of introductions, and if you could include your connections to climate change science and education research, and if you could also describe your experiences teaching climate science to students, and what brought you to use culturally relevant approaches to climate science in your own context and in research. So to start, I'm Veronica McGowan, and I work at the Institute for Science and Math Education, where Ellie completed her degree several years ago.
Okay, hi, I'm Ellie Walsh, and I'm an assistant professor at San Jose State University, and I have a joint appointment in science education and climate science. And I started actually my career as an oceanographer studying past climate changes and got very interested in the social context for how people were understanding climate change. So I actually then switched my career, went into learning sciences, and have been working in climate change education and science education ever since then in a variety of different contexts. So at UW, I was involved, when I did my degree there, I was involved in some different curricular development projects, worked with climate scientists, thinking about climate scientists and their education and communication. And since coming to San Jose State, my work has been highly focused on equity and agency of underrepresented communities in climate change and climate action.
So I'm also Suzanne Berry. I'm an assistant professor at University of Maine. And the way I got into climate change education is kind of weird because I was in a science ed world and I was integrating climate change as a part of my earth science course for pre-service teachers at first. And then kind of saw this very interesting discourse evolving and shaping in my classroom because of the identities and the agencies my pre-service teachers bringing in to the discussion. And then kind of in a lucky way, I got involved in a Made Clear project, which was an NSF-funded project to support teachers to integrate climate change into their curriculum, into their lessons in Maryland and Delaware region. And I kind of like reshaped my research agenda and set up a whole research on climate change, specifically around teacher sense making of scientific practices as they're learning climate change.
Thank you.
So my name is Joe Henderson. I'm on the faculty at in Environment and Society at Paul Smith College in the Adirondacks in upstate New York. And if you're not familiar with the Adirondacks, it's a 6 million acre kind of very protected area, and it's very beautiful up here. We are a very small school in a very rural environment, and so I can say more about what that work is like later. But I was a geology major in college, an environmental geology major, and was working with some climate scientists at the time, and then taught middle school earth science for a bunch of years, where I taught climate change as part of a kind of more formal science curriculum. Went back to grad school at the University of Rochester and was trained in essentially the anthropology of environmental education. And I do a lot of work around science education as well. So I'm interested in these kind of things from a sociocultural perspective and a materialist perspective. And really kind of formally, my doctoral work was on sustainability as a kind of upper class practice and the educational aspect of that. But I started poking more formally around climate change towards the end of grad school, mostly because we started writing around fracking as an educational issue and really understanding, like, how do you think about energy as an educational issue? And then that's intimately related to climate change. So I did a postdoc, and I'm still working on some of that stuff at the University of Delaware on the Made Clear project, which is one of the kind of NSF climate change education projects. So we're moving some of that research out right now, and I can say more about all of those things if you want.
Great, thank you. Yeah, we look forward to hearing more about all of your research as we go through the webinar. So the first question that I thought we'd talk about today is, starting with Ellie, if you could talk about your findings, or more broadly with the group, your research and experiences about the intersection of identities and learning about climate change. So the title of our webinar is How Does Political Identity Shape How Learners Engage with Climate Science? But something that really emerged for me in reading the article was that the students came in with sort of their surface identities, for example, being a rush baby, but then through ethnographic methods, we were able to see that they actually had multiple identities that were surfaced and leveraged to help them make sense of climate change data. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And before I go too far into talking about the findings, I definitely want to acknowledge that this work was done as part of a Gates Foundation funded project, which was led by Phil Bell at the University of Washington when I was a graduate student there. And the work in this paper was done with Blakely Surasaki, who's the co-author. And yeah, this was an interesting pilot of a curriculum that we were doing in a design-based research study, where we went in to try the ecological impacts of climate change curriculum. And like you just said, Veronica, all of these different identities quickly surfaced, especially the political ones in the classroom. And it became this really interesting space to look at the different identities that students were bringing into the classroom and the kind of identity work that students were doing around, for example, coming from a conservative family with a dad who only listens to Rush Limbaugh, and that's who he's getting information from, and those are the values that are shaping the interactions in the home. And then coming into a science classroom where previously you've thought of yourself as a really good science student, and seeing this now as in tension with what's happening in your home life. So the three students that we talk about in this paper, two of whom are from conservative Republican families, Luke and Timothy, and then one from a liberal family, Gareth. They all had different ways that they were negotiating who they were and who they wanted to be in relation to the science, but also just in relation to their social status or their social standing in the class, or being interested in science, or being Democratic or Republican. So I think the key findings about identity in the classroom that I would want to highlight, the first is that because there were so many different identities that came into play, we actually found that allowing students like Luke and Timothy, who came in pretty conservative and sure climate change was not happening, that it was a political thing, not a scientific thing, allowing students to experience these moments of identity dissonance where science and school and political identities did come into conflict, and doing that in a supportive atmosphere where students were allowed to pursue these conflicts and attempt to resolve them. That was critical for the students, and that this dissonance between these different identities was actually productive from a disciplinary identity development standpoint. And you asked earlier about taking this culturally responsive approach to climate change, and that's what we had tried to do with the curriculum that we were piloting here. And what was interesting was when we were analyzing and reflecting on this, it wasn't for Luke and Timothy, just about us providing them pathways, of interest or relevance into the material. They really had to, for themselves, decide if they even wanted to become that type of person who thought climate change was happening. That was an identity, almost decision. There was an identity consequence for them. So we have to think about, in curricular design, when we use these culturally responsive pedagogies, supporting youth and building these bridges between home and school, that there's also a question for the students of, do you even want to walk on that bridge, right? Or is it ultimately too big of a personal threat or consequence to your family or to your political self to even take that step? So these different multiple identities that come into play in the classroom, there's kind of two sides to that bridge that we have to think about. And then the other kind of last identity piece that I would mention that we can talk about more later if it's of interest is thinking about the students' understanding of their and human society's place and agency in respect to these processes that happen on different time scales. So how you construct identity not only on different time scales, so in a moment in a classroom or across your life or as part of a society, but also in relation to time scales. So how do you understand yourself as able to be an actor who can shape a process that's occurring on what we have for a long time thought of as geologic timescales versus things that are now happening very quickly. So for topics like climate change, thinking about identities in relation to time and timescales may be more important than what might come up in other kinds of science. So those are kind of the three ways that I was seeing multiple identities surface and being negotiated as students were working through this curriculum.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It sounds like there's a lot of challenges that come into the constraints of a typical classroom period, whether it's 50 minutes or a 90-minute block, to think about identity change, surfacing multiple identity changes, and then thinking about time for both the individual, but also time of the earth in multiple scales. So Dr. Henderson and Dr. Sunbury, what are your experiences with working with students' multiple identities and also teacher multiple identities as you're going through professional development? And I am curious if you find students are more willing to walk that bridge than maybe adults who may have, I don't know, more solidified identities in their communities.
So, I mean, different things, I would say. So there's probably differences, you know, in terms of when you look at the time scale and the agency, when you're a student, you know, middle school students, when you see, oh, the impacts can be influential on me versus, oh, you know, I'm gonna die soon. This is really not gonna impact me. So what I see in terms of like my research, it's kind of like thinking about what Ellie said. When I talk to teachers, they would be, so there's two different view among teachers, and some of them were like, I'm a science teacher, I'm a chemistry teacher, I'm a science teacher, and I would teach this just as science. So I'm not gonna even talk about my own identity. I don't wanna bring about any of the social, cultural, or political aspects of this climate change issue to my classroom. Even though this teacher accepts the idea that human impact is important on climate change. And then there's another teacher who says, it is important to engage my students into those conversations, and I will have those negotiations like it happened in the classroom that was described in the paper. So I see a lot of differences in the teacher identities and how they want to create that atmosphere. So I was going to actually kind of ask Ellie a question here about creating that supportive atmosphere. Like how is teacher, like one thing that mentioned in the paper is to have the idea that teacher doesn't really share you know, his own identity or what he thinks exactly about climate change at the beginning, but then at one point it makes it, you know, it becomes more explicit to the students. So I get a lot of questions like that from the teachers that I work with, like when and how to express our own views about climate change to the students. So I was wondering, like, what was the teacher's role there? Because to me, that's a really tricky point in creating that atmosphere. And then related to that, I'm also wondering, how did the design team, like the people who designed the curriculum, had any impact on creating that atmosphere?
Yeah, that's a great question. The teacher positioning is so important. So in this particular case, you know, it was the teacher's decision how he wanted to broach that with the students, and he decided because that he would rather hold off on saying what he thought about climate change, especially in those initial discussions where he was really trying to elicit what the students thought. So I don't remember exactly, you have the transcript somewhere, I don't remember exactly what he said, but it was something like, you know, right now I just want to learn what you know about climate change. I know something, like I'll tell you what I think later on. And, you know, the first interchange of the unit was, so what is climate change? And the answer is Democrats, right? So that's kind of what happened. And so I think that kind of made him even maybe take like a little bit more of a step back on sharing what his own ideas were, because it was in the first conversation that he learned, and we learned that the students were very politically polarized and had a lot of political ideas about what was going on. So I think that's kind of what happened there. But then eventually, you know, he did kind of make the joke that if someone could bring in a peer-reviewed article that was not refuted, that was showing that climate change was real, or was not real, excuse me, he would eat his shoe. And so it became like a joke in the classroom, right? And all the students were like, have you eaten your shoe yet? Right? And like, you know, kind of looking for evidence and stuff. So I thought that was a nice way to kind of open up the possibility that, yes, this is science and we have different sides, but also there's standards, right? There's a peer review standard. Can you find something, you know, that meets that standard? And, you know, if so, I'll eat my shoe, right? So I think it's a little bit, depends, I would say, on the teacher's relationship with the students and how comfortable you feel that like you sharing would elicit their sharing, or would your sharing kind of shut down what some of your students might be thinking. So I think it's especially in different classrooms, I would probably take pretty different approaches to how I would kind of as myself position myself as a teacher. And then in terms of the curriculum design, the thing that we did was we started with the curriculum. In addition to eliciting prior knowledge, we had students watch videos of people in the media talking about climate change and had them break down some of the evidence and the argumentation used. There's a lot on argumentation in this particular curriculum. So break down the evidence, think about, was it scientific? Was it not? Where was it coming from? How credible was it? But that at least served to get a whole bunch of ideas on the table. Because my opinion is, and I think, you know, this is pretty well backed by sociocultural ideas, is that, you know, those sociocultural ideas, that media, it's in the classroom whether or not you talk about it. So as the teacher, being there to help students think about things seems a little bit more effective than only teaching the science and standing back and then letting students kind of sort through all the other stuff on their own.
Yeah, well, thank you. And I agree with the idea that like you set the norms, and what is the norms of a science like climate science? I mean, and I'm saying this like climate science because over the 6 years that I've been getting more and more into climate science education research, I also realized that the nature of data, or the norms, the scientific norms that students are used to, are not always exactly like the data that we have in climate science. You know, like even one of the things you emphasize, like, you know, looking at that data temporally and then think about the impacts of it later on. But even just making sense of that data in relation to the big claims that we have is much more complicated. And then, you know, some of the case studies where you discuss how students kind of pull up the multiple lines of evidence and then say, oh, actually, you know, you might be right. Now I'm agreeing more with you. So that kind of like, I guess, was helping there to the teacher and the, you know, and the whole classroom atmosphere to make that shift, because that's important, like being able to see that shift, right?
So I'll add on this, and this is actually bringing up a lot of thoughts, and I'm going to try to speak, I guess, a little bit more broadly, because I don't do a lot of direct professional development. And I see schools as one place where education happens across a broader society, and I think the literature on informal education does a nice job of explaining some of this, or at least the kind of the way schools are bound spaces in some ways. But like as we're all talking, I'm thinking about my friend David Long's work in his ethnography of evolution education, and you know, the way in which science, or particular types of science or scientific claims, can be threatening to people's deeply held identities, their understanding of the world. In that case, you know, evolution was challenging people's understanding of what happens to them after they die, and thus was often rejected because it meant kind of resurfacing your understanding of the world, or the kind of system of meaning. Climate science happens this way. There are particular science findings that are enrolled in these kind of more controversial discourses. Gun control research is a good example of this. Vaccine science, genetically modified organisms. It's not kind of necessarily all science. There is a lot of science, to use kind of Bruno Latour's term here, it's kind of normalized in society, right? Like we don't talk much about pasteurization as controversial. Although I'm sure there are, there certainly are movements that would challenge me there. But I think just one quick point about teachers here. Our project, and I think there was an acknowledgement on our project, on the Made Clear project, that we were doing a really good job of working with teachers who were interested in teaching climate change. But that's in some ways a selected population. And there are a whole lot of teachers who just are ambivalent about it, or don't know enough, or are actively hostile to it. And one of the things that we did in some of the research that I'm going to present at AERA and AAG coming up in the next couple of weeks is, what about teachers who are hostile to it? What decisions are they making? What happens in those classrooms? And kind of what are those dynamics like, right? So in this paper, you already had a teacher who was sympathetic to including that science. And we know that even if your state has standards, that doesn't mean necessarily teachers are still kind of have agency and are capable of making decisions about what is and isn't included in the classroom. So there's a kind of like variegated pattern of implementation here. Like, who's actually doing climate science? What do those teachers care about? What are their kind of political priors? And then how does that impact student learning, student engagement? Like, I would love to go into a classroom and study kind of a climate denier teacher and climate science denier teacher and see what happens in that space. Catherine Stevenson, who's at North Carolina State, has done some of this work and has found, and I think it's not ethnographic work, but it's survey work, looking at whether or not teachers' beliefs, personal beliefs, translate to student learning. And she has found that they don't. That the kind of, but that's that's one study. There's more work to be done in that regard. So I think we need to take seriously teachers' political and cultural commitments as well, right? Evolution education, I think, is really instructive here, right? There's been a decades-long process to kind of deal with the issue of public misunderstanding of evolution, and we've barely moved the needle on that. And I think that's really interesting to think about the limitations there. I don't know, we could talk about whether this is a similar or different issue, but
Yeah.
that's what I'm kind of interested in. And, we know that not everybody cares about science in the same kind of way, right? Like, so, Dan Kahan's work on this is really interesting. Climate change deniers are highly scientifically literate. They're just picking and choosing different types of science for their own kind of ends. We should think about that, I think, in a more sophisticated way. So anyway, just some thoughts that are coming up for me.
So in that sense, I kind of see that, like, at least in the cases that Ellie looked, it shows like really in depth on how we can actually move the needle a little bit for the students who respect science and evidence and tries to understand what data looks like in this kind of environment. So I think, that was interesting about this article for me, that it kind of shows for those cases how the needle has been moved. And then that kind of got me, kind of thinking on a lot of the things I saw in my findings. Like, one of them, I had teachers who came to a workshop with the idea that, we certainly believe that human has the impact on climate change. And all of them said this same claim, but then I confronted them with some of the very common denial theories that was on media. So they had a hard time coming up with counter arguments. And in some cases, they just agreed with the denial theory itself, like, sun might be the reason, the solar cycles might be the reason for the current changing climates. So what you're saying, Joe, is true in a way that, like, sometimes the deniers have a strong scientific understanding or knowledge, in one way, but then also people who accepts the idea that human impact is important on climate change, they might not understand the science truly, but they might still agree with that claim. So
right, but I think, so like, none of us are climate scientists, right? Mm-hmm. We have to kind of trust specific elites and follow specific kind of elite narratives. And I think different people are working with different elites, right? Like in this paper, Rush Limbaugh is an elite narrator of kind of people's lives and their understanding of those things. And I think there's some really interesting work coming out in like science communication. I'm looking at an article right now. You know, is it like, how do political elites shape people's understanding of climate change, and what do you do in that situation? I mean, I think one thing to say though is that students, and what I really like about this paper is that students are very much trying to figure out their identity. Like it is kind of less baked into the cake, or maybe less rigid, but you know, giving that space for them to do that work, I think is a really important thing to do, and to not. I think it's also really complicated, and I like this paper for that reason. There's this open question, I think, and something that I know people are struggling with is like, you know, is it possible to kind of disentangle someone's identity from what is known by science? Or is science going to kind of always threaten particular identities, and we just have to be okay with that? I mean, you look at the history of scientific findings, it's threatened religious identities, it's threatened, in this case, political identities, economic ideologies, things like that.
Something that stands out to me with this curriculum design, as Ellie was talking earlier, in the beginning, they did bring controversy into the classroom, but then I thought the curriculum took a slightly different approach in that it actually engaged students with primary data around climate science in a way that positioned them as experts. So for example, Luke's intersection of wanting to be a scientist, he really engaged with the data and then the social argumentation, so the practices of science, I think helped him cross that bridge to accepting data. I think the traditional approach for climate science or science education in general is for us to share the claims and also the evidence that go with the claims. But it seems in this sense, the students were generating their own evidence from models, raw data, and also the help with experts. It really stood out to me, just as Joseph was talking about who these experts are and who holds weight in contemporary society. We had Madeline come into the classroom who helped also shape Timothy's identity as an expert and make sense of some of the data that he couldn't make sense of himself. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how students engage with meaning making around data and climate science information, if you think that also impacts their identity.
Yeah, and actually connected to that, and also connected, I think, to the conversation that was just going on, I was thinking about work that I've done. I've done ethnographic work with climate scientists, and I've just, you know, I've been working with them for nine years now. So I just followed up with everybody again, and this is work I'll be presenting at ICLS. And one of the big changes from when I started working with them to now is they're all much less willing to talk to the general public. That might be an overstatement, but there's a trend towards being less willing to talk to the general public, both whether or not you think climate change is happening, because either people feel like they're preaching to the choir, and people are not as interested in knowing the details of the science necessarily. And again, this is the impressions that the scientists have had. You know, I already think this thing. Sometimes, you know, if think climate is happening, I might think it to an extreme. I might over attribute things to climate change. You know, going back to you were saying about excuse me, about having teachers who think that climate change is happening but don't know, like aren't able to then respond to the evidence against it, kind of in that same vein, but in terms of over attributing things to climate change. And what some of these scientists were talking about, because of that, they were very critical of, I think a lot of us are, about how we're getting information now in social media, and how over the past 9 years, that's something that has really changed in terms of how we're interacting with scientific information in a way that seems to be perpetuating some of these political polarizations that we're seeing. And they're calling for, in the interviews that I just did, more engagement with data, less coverage and longer form coverage, where people are able to engage more deeply. Things like what the New York Times does, where they sometimes allow you to go in and manipulate, data sets and kind of create your own things like that kind of thing with more of a story and narrative format to it. And I think that's exactly what we saw being successful in the classroom, was engaging with the data, being able to build a meaningful story. They had to create an infographic where they communicated to their community something about climate change and its impacts. And the thing that we really saw, one of the things is that it took revisiting the data and different kinds of data multiple times over an extended time period, and in order for you to kind of figure out what you thought about it and understand, like, if we look at Timothy, is this a 1,000,000-year cycle? That's a great hypothesis, right? Like, that's a great idea. Like, let's explore it. But you can't explore that in 50 minutes, right? You need to come back to it over time. So some of these, whether it's working directly with data and creating evidence yourself, whether it's learning experiences that take a little bit longer, you can come back to over time, experiences that are more in-depth or more narrative structured, that provide some of these ways of kind of more deeply engaging with data and with the social and human impacts. These things seem to be helpful. The issue that I always think about when I look at this paper and I'm like, wow, that's great, they changed their mind. And then my next thought is, okay, how do we possibly scale this, right? If, I get people all the time saying to me, like, how do, this is very interesting. How do we do this on a whole societal level, right? And if you look at kind of the level of engagement that it took for students and the army of people that were there, researchers and teachers and other students and scientists coming in, it becomes kind of a challenge to think about, what does this look like on a larger scale?
So, Ellie, on the idea that, like, when you talk about the time that's given in the classroom to be able to explore the timeline of climate change, which is huge, right? And it's really important to really understand the big claim. So that was like, and that was one of the topics kind of like we decided to talk about. And it's really interesting to me because I'm just seeing on one single case study that there's this one pre-service teacher who went to like variety of workshops and different classrooms that teaches climate change, part of that, course, part of that workshop. She was engaging more and more, and that kind of like grabbed my attention to understand why she's more engaged and more interested, because that's the way to learn that. That's the way to be able to explore that huge data set. Like, it's impossible, as you said, to really grasp this on a 50-minute long lesson, or if it is just like a one course, one shot workshop idea. So when I looked at that one pre-service teacher, what I was recognizing also, like, where the people that she works with, like, or talks with, when she goes and talks with like her parents or the teachers that she worked with, and they talk about like what are going to be the impacts of climate change in the future for them. And when she keeps hearing, oh, like it's not going to be a big impact in our timeline, she kind of gets like disengaged. And she says, I really wanted to learn this, but I also feel like talking to these people, they see it's not important. And I just feel like I have to first go through this big struggle to understand it is important. And then when she goes, like, works with middle school students as a part of her internship or the project that she gets engaged in, she kind of sees a completely different thing, because she realizes, like, this youth thinks the climate change impacts are very important. It's on a timeline that might possibly impact them. So she comes back and says, well, now I'm feeling much more hopeful. I want to learn even more, because I feel like there is a kind of population, which is our youth, who understand this is important, and this puts me as an important role as an educator. So that kind of like shifts her whole agency around, like going and at least learning about climate change even before doing anything about it. But at least like in terms of engaging herself into various activities, workshops, and courses to put the pieces of the puzzle together herself. Because as you said, when you try to like scale this up, not a lot of people will be within a project where climate change will be taught extensively within one course maybe.
Yeah, it's so interesting because Joe, you brought up evolution, and one of the things I always think of as a little different between climate change and evolution is that the climate change, the impacts are only becoming more noticeable, right, over time. And I would want to ask, with this teacher, is she thinking about some of the things that are happening right now as climate impacts? Because I'm just starting to now see, and I'm in California, in a very kind of liberal, climate-friendly area. I'm now starting to see, undergraduates I work with or teachers that I work with recognizing that, these wildfires, that might be climate related, right? Or these hurricanes, those might be climate related. I was teaching a climate change 101 kind of class in fall, and every week it was a fire, it was a hurricane, there was something that we could recognize as having climate signature happening. So I guess I have a question about whether it's going to evolve over time, and we might see more of what you're seeing if people are starting to recognize these impacts as already happening. So I guess I would be curious about what you've seen with the teachers, and do you think this teacher would recognize that as an impact that would impact her, or is this distance, right, this time, distance that we've seen for decades now when you kind of ask people about climate change, do you still see that holding?
So like for this specific teacher that I worked on, she actually got engaged into climate change after the Sandy storm they experienced in New Jersey. So she kind of saw the impacts of it, where they couldn't even live in their house for a while. So does, her parents saw the same challenge. But then when she talks about, taking action, doing something about, setting up their AC in a way that they use energy efficiently, etc. So her parents' argument was like, well, maybe I'll see 1 or 2 more of these hurricanes in my lifetime, but does that worth like not using my AC when it's like 100 degrees out there, or like, using it less? And that was very disheartening for her. And then she goes back to, like the middle schools, and middle school students sees kind of like what she saw after the Sandy storm, kind of like what your students, talking about, this is happening right now, and all the wildfires. So those students that she interacted with was talking about how climate change impacts the shellfish in Maryland, and then talking about sea level rise. So, but then she was having a hard time having those conversations with teacher colleagues that she interacted with at times, because they're like, well, I love to drive my car because it gives me an independent, and then like, her parents, even though they also experienced the Sandy storm with her, they were still kind of trying to weigh in, like, am I gonna suffer through my life because I'm gonna see a couple more hurricanes? You know what I mean? So that was their evaluation. But when she goes back to middle school students, she's like, oh yeah, I should really be a teacher in middle school, because they are seeing the value in this, and they are making me feel more hopeful about our future generations.
Listening to you talk, I think this issue of time and space is really interesting, and something that should be engaged just more broadly in I think, learning theory in general. But Larry Hamilton, who's a friend who's at the University of New Hampshire, has done some really interesting social sociology work on kind of proximity to extreme climate events, and has found actually that it doesn't matter, that people are less likely to attribute those to climate change, that the bigger variable in their the way they understand those is partisan ideology. So partisan ideology overwhelms even the visceral experience of extreme weather from climate change. In the same way that it overwhelms religious identity. It's a kind of stronger identity marker for a lot of people, for very highly motivated kind of reasoners. I guess, and also I'm reminded of some analysis that we did that we still need to write up. There's this way in which, like, if you think of climate change as a story, right, that kind of shapes and narrates people's lives, or not, different people are going to engage with it in different ways. I'm often really interested in this like like, where did it even come from? Like, why we never talk about the kind of like genesis or the origin of climate change as a colonial project. If you look at, so I teach climate change now in the context of an upper level sustainable development class, right? And in order to understand sustainable development, you have to understand like why some countries have quote developed and why others are quote undeveloped or developing. And that's deeply rooted in the history of colonialism, in the history of racial capitalism. There are a lot, industrialization, and a lot of those, especially for people of privilege, a lot of those processes are hidden from us and are kind of hidden by space and time. And what's the implication of that, right? So, you know, you look at like the causes of climate change, it's primarily people in wealthy societies who are consuming lots and lots of carbon. How does a science teacher engage with that kind of social reality? And I think, I don't know that science education is necessarily good at that yet. And nor do we really train or ask science teachers to have that kind of critique or understanding. We just published a piece in the International Journal of Science Education that kind of traced teacher identity through to student learning using some work on conceptual mobility. And we found actually that the teacher was kind of backgrounding those questions, that, you know, she was doing a really good job of showing the evidence and talking about like, how do we know climate change is happening? What are the mechanisms? But absent from that was any sort of like, okay, like now what? Now what do you actually do? And once you make that switch from like the pure science to, or the evidence, you're asking teachers and students to then make claims about how the future world should be structured, right? What ought we to do? And when you're in the land of ought, you're in values and ideologies and the creation of different futures. I mean, I was really happy to see some of that work in the theory here. And not everybody's engaged in the same futures project, and some people resist knowledge because it conflicts with their futures project. So I think that's really rich terrain for people to do work on. And I think that's certainly where I'm going. I mean, I do a lot of work with rural conservatives and first generation college students from rural areas. And, you know, the conversation around climate change is somewhat similar. It tends to be, you know, you say the word climate change and it's enrolled in this kind of partisan discourse. And on the one hand, we can see that maybe as a bad thing. And on the other hand, maybe that's productive, right? Like, why is it that people disagree on these things? Political differences are not just like, oh, you think this way and I think this way. Like, there's real material struggle there, right? Like politics is how we decide who gets what. And I think that's, you know, some of the European researchers that do work on this don't look at this kind of like, they look at it from an agonistic perspective of like, how is political disagreement productive? That's a lot to ask a science teacher, I think, to do.
So also, like, you know, I definitely agree on the impact of the political disagreement and you know, even, you know, shaping the beginning repertoire of students when they're coming into that classroom. But one of the other things that, you know, I realized looking at other scientific ideas, like, you know, the solar eclipse, it was something that just recently happened and everyone was excitedly talking about it and went to observe it, independent of their political views. So it was a kind of, you know, and I talk a lot with the climate scientists, because I actually, kind of like Ellie, I try to do research on them as well, try to understand how they explain climate science and how they highlight the important ideas in climate science. One of the things I realized, you know, when they talk about the nature of data and the people, like, people understand the solar eclipse because it's a certain time that it's going to happen, and it happens at the time that scientists predicts. So it's just clearly at the exact time, and it happens because it's something that you can measure with two variables that are pretty known and easy to predict. Like, there isn't 100 different variables that's impacting that system to change the time of the solar eclipse. And then you're seeing scientists trying to predict the path of Irma, and like within, you know, couple hours, the path of the hurricane changes. And then like as people seeing weather and climate events related, they're like, oh, you know, like this climate models and weather models, they're not very reliable because they change all the time. So it's, you know, there's a different kind of like different data set here that we're playing with, different set of variables that are interacting. And I feel like when especially Garrett, I think, is going through that data and like trying to understand why it is like this here and there. And I feel like that's what he was trying to do, kind of to make that shift. Yeah. Yeah.
But
And
it is, I mean, like climate science, there's this tendency to talk about climate science as if it's this really complicated thing. And yeah, there are definitely dimensions of it. But I mean, at a fundamental level, we're just taking carbon out of the ground, lighting it on fire, and it's going into the atmosphere, right? Like,
and why?
like there's this, is there this point at which, and I don't have an answer to this, and I just throw this question out there, but like, is too much complexity just obscuring what's ultimately actually a pretty simple thing, right? Like the structure of society is such that we need carbon, we burn it, it goes into the atmosphere and warms the earth. I don't know.
It's the predicting the future part, I think, that trips people up, right? Like that specific process is pretty straightforward. It's the what's going to happen because, and this is then what ties into the policy piece, which I think you were getting at a little bit, Joe, about how do we make decisions, excuse me, how do we make decisions based on uncertain future, right? And how do we do that in a way that is sustainable when we don't know exactly what's going to happen? And starting in the 90s with the UNFCCC, the first, you know, climate change conference, you know, they decided that not knowing what exactly would happen is not a reason not to act. Now, we can argue about whether or not we have upheld that or let ourselves be held back by uncertainty. But I think there's this tension between the science, which has an inherent uncertainty to it, and then political action and political argumentation where you're trying to do something. And that has been an ongoing issue with climate change policy, which I think also affects how learners understand climate science. If, you know, what is happening isn't exactly what the model looked like, or maybe it is what the model looked like, but on a different time scale or in a different way, or it's just a model, or you can start kind of chipping away at all of this because we're trying to project the future, which is very complicated, even though the models are doing a pretty good job at it. And I wanted to just follow up on the point that you brought up again about this idea of colonialism and development and some of these power issues that are in play in climate change. And I think it's always really interesting to look at what kind of has been happening and who's been impacted for a long time, like, say, indigenous communities in Alaska, who've had erosion and severe weather problems, similar to, say, a Sandy type situation, though not the same weather phenomenon, but with similar impacts, but one is much more high profile than the other. Or areas of the world that are already water resource strained, but that, you know, the average person wouldn't have really heard about. So kind of what impacts are we hearing about, who's deciding what's important to take action on, and also what science, what the science of climate change is shaped by these power dynamics as well. We don't have long historical records that are valued by Western science in large parts of the world, from Africa or from parts of South America. We don't have existing, you know, observed temperature records going back the same period of time. So the science itself and the certainties in our projections have those same issues of colonialism, of power, of what counts as evidence in the science. And it's a little bit of a different can of worms, but I think it kind of is another way of illustrating the complexities of how the science is related to social development and social power, and then ultimately decision making and action on climate change.
Right, and there's this thing, you know, I've written and published a lot on kind of neoliberalism in environmental education, science education a little bit. And I think one of the things that I notice a lot in climate change curriculum is this way in which solutions, there's this kind of like responsibilization of solutions. So we often talk about like, well, you know, buy different light bulbs or buy a hybrid car. And there are these very almost individualistic responsibility. And you know, if you look at like what actually causes, like what the big drivers of carbon emissions are industrial processes, large scale production processes of energy production and things like that, that are like even the way in which we talk about solutions is kind of enrolled in this political imagination. And so there's this like, you know, on the one hand, you want to tell students like, do good individual, like be in ethical consumption, think about your local place, but scaling that up and really looking at these issues at scale, really affecting this at scale, those are policy issues. And that's where people are going to get into disagreements depending upon which political kind of group you identify with. And I mean, I think this is all made much, much harder by the increasingly partisan nature of American society. And kind of the political sciences talk about this in terms of negative partisanship, which is a fun term to Google and go down that one. But yeah, I don't know. I actually think climate change education is getting harder and harder.
We have just a few minutes left. So currently there are no questions posted, but I did want to, for those listening, if you'd like to post a question to the panel, now would be a good time.
So until you say a question, Veronica, I'm just gonna talk about, you know, a couple of the issues that Joe and Ellie brought up. And I want to kind of like going back to, you know, how do we help teachers and students piece. And I want to say, Joe, I kind of started with the idea that it is a simple topic. That's what I thought, you know, and I had a actually, you know, minor in geoscience as an undergrad. And then I thought, well, you know, it is not that, it shouldn't be that hard. But then going into more and more details of like seeing teachers struggle through coming up with counter arguments to the very specific claims and understanding how, like, let's say ocean acidification. How do we know for sure that increasing atmospheric CO2 and temperature rising, you know, impacts the ocean acidification and the life of, let's say, oysters? So that gets really complicated. That you need to pull on from life sciences, understanding the life cycle of oysters, and then, you know, the ocean, whole acidification problem, pulling on chemistry, and, you know, it's actually pretty complicated. And the whole like climate data is huge and messy. So I kind of understanding that we need to appreciate the complexity of some of the issues that contributes to the bigger claim of human impact on climate change.
Right, and I think, you know, there's this way in which schooling itself is kind of spatially and temporally limited, right? So, you know, you look at the historical disciplining within even the sciences. So where is this taught? It's often, it depends. I don't think we do a nice job in this country of just general earth science. There are a few states that do a better job than others, but then you have all of these other aspects, right? Like of industrialization. And so like, how do you link the social studies class to the earth science class? And can you even do that given the kind of spatial and temporal logics of schooling that preclude that from happening, right?
It's actually, I mean, I completely agree with that. And one of the strongest things I've ever observed as a geoscientist colleague of mine who was talking about, it was giving like a month-long climate change lessons and lectures. And what I saw he was doing is pulling up from like world history and going back in data to current time and present. And he was doing that constantly. Like on every little subclaim that he kind of mentions in the class, he was going back and forth into the current time in data and then pull on, you know, like from the businesses, like how businesses impacted the way that scientists were even able to figure out various CO2 data. And then, you know, he was pulling out, you know, world histories of different countries and like how they individually impacted and make decisions around climate change. And I saw that being very effective, but I also, you know, appreciate that he had a lot of education on that to be able to do that kind of, you know, lesson. So, but I agree with what you're saying that, you know, like getting this temporally and spatially from different spaces, but then have the vision to be able to put together those pieces like that professor does. Like, and it's not easy, but, you know, it's kind of like the way to understand how to respond to that big claim scientifically.
I also think this is just a comment I want to throw out there, but I try to be aware of the way in which like climate change, this is a bit of a joke, but it's a serious one. Like we ask teachers to do a lot already. And yeah, like this is one more thing that we're asking teachers to solve, like solve climate change, figure that out, like solve gun violence, figure that out, right? Like there's this way in which like educational institutions themselves become the kind of like institution of last resort when a society can't figure out how to solve those problems itself, right? And I don't know, it's like we talk about schooling, like is but one place where this needs to happen. There are many, many other venues of climate change education that arguably might be more important than schooling to focus on right now. I mean, schooling is a kind of, Randy Curran, who's a philosopher of these things, talks about schooling as an important project around these issues, but kind of secondary to the need to shift and move policy immediately. You know, I don't know if like, we're asking teachers to take bullets for their students because we can't figure out certain problems, right? Like, I don't know, I just want to lay that on the table. I think there's this tendency to fetishize education as like a solution. And yeah, it's important. We're all doing this really cool, important work, but you know, there are other domains that might be more important to focus on in the immediate term if you're going to talk about rapidly reducing carbon consumption.
Yeah,
so, it's 10 o'clock, so I was thinking that this would be a good transition point for us to maybe think about where the future of climate change learning and research can be situated. So we have the classroom, the political sphere, and across settings. But also, Ellie, if you want to finish your thought before we shift to the new question.
Oh, no, it's fine. I can spin it into where the future of climate change education should be going. Well, I was going to say one thing. You know, you see a lot of work done in science communication around climate change in the media, and then you see a lot of work, growing amount of work, science education, climate change in the classroom. And what you don't see as much of is how learning spans multiple contexts and multiple different ways that people learn about climate change. So how do we think about social media? How do we think about it, you know, a classroom? How do we think about the fact that a student both participates in social media, consumes social media, and also is in the classroom, right? So kind of, I think, more cross-context work and thinking about students and learning and adults and learning more holistically is across all the different contexts is important. How is the family down the street learning about climate and energy in their everyday life, right? We have a lot of survey work. We don't have a lot of ethnographic work or other work that is just happening in everyday communities. There is participatory work that's being done, which I think is a great direction for us to go in terms of understanding the needs of communities and how we how people are making sense of climate change in their lives. So I see kind of this opportunity for us to better study what's actually happening with climate change in addition to developing interventions for classrooms. So I would like to see us moving to thinking more deeply about some of these issues of who is learning about climate change, who is getting to make decisions, whose voice are we hearing, how do we better understand what the needs of communities are through some of these methods that I think learning scientists have in their tool belt, and how can we then support this equitable decision making around climate change.
I'll say very quickly, we have a couple of sessions coming up at AERA on exactly this topic. The journal Environmental Education Research is publishing, I think Asla, you and I have published there quite a bit. Their editor, Alan Reed, is doing a lot of work on climate change education and is going to be doing some special issues on that. We just published a piece last year with co-authors in educational studies that is kind of like, it's like Dear Education as a field broadly, like why should you care about climate change? And then we kind of like list out a bunch of possible questions that people could investigate. That's just a start. I agree with you, Ellie. I think there's much more work in many other domains that can be done on this. And I think learning sciences, the anthropology of learning is really useful in that regard and getting into alternative spaces. I'm really interested in conservative ideology and how that's shaping learning, specifically around like elite narration. So I want to interview my congresswoman. She's a conservative Republican who takes climate change seriously. What is she up against? That's really interesting, I think, to think about. So I'm really interested in like elite narrators at this point.
So I'm going to comment on the ethnographic research piece because I think that was really important to see this kind of work. For me, like this is telling me how that shift can happen rather than, you know, this shift happens or what people think right now, but it really gives me a story of how this shift can happen in the classroom, and then gives me an idea when I'm designing a program, a curriculum for the teachers to kind of think about that piece and give them a suggestion based on what can happen and how it can be happening in the classroom. So and in relation to that, I like, you know, ethnographic discourse studies, looking into the details of the discourse, like ownership of the ideas, because sometimes when students talk about impacts, like who do they owe it to? Like they talk about it, you know, for themselves sometimes, and they kind of like talk about it as others' problem, or this can impact like their feelings and emotions at times. So looking at more like in-depth discourse analysis of how people explain climate change and the impacts and their agency about it, I think is going to be important work around climate change education. And another thing I'm really interested in recently is to use interactional ethnography approach and to look at how the design teams impact the decisions of the teacher, of the instructor or the teacher who's going into the classroom. The meetings that the design team and the scientists have with the teachers kind of shapes the classroom discourse, and then that classroom discourse can be reshaped by the student identities. Because there's, you know, and in this paper too, we're seeing, you know, when students work with the scientists and the research team design a certain curricula, like understanding the impacts of that structure can also be important and give us ideas on like how the teachers and instructors are taking that to their classrooms.
And also, and I think I'm thinking of something Shirley Bryce Heath said to me once, where she was like, you know, where are all the papers about how this stuff fails, right? Like who's going in and looking at like all of these best interventions and curriculum designs, and like when do they fail spectacularly and why? And like, you know, that would be my plea to journal editors to take those kinds of papers seriously. Also, as well as the ethnographic stuff. I mean, I think ethnographic work takes a long time to do, and is really, really rich and often isn't professionally rewarded. And I think that's, or people aren't given the space and time in this, when you look at the pressures that academics have of kind of constantly crank out these publications, like, I don't know, I think there's real richness in things that take time, and there's this whole other like politics of academic knowledge production that I think is a much bigger conversation, but is also very interesting here.
Just to add on to that, I think one of the interesting things about Gareth is by some metrics, he was a failure, right? You could look at it that way. He started very sure climate change was happening, and by the end he was like, I think I need to learn more about this because I'm just not sure right now after kind of hearing, you know, what Luke and Timothy and the rest of the kind of conservative students were saying. And so I think as, you know, researchers, it's important to look for those stories too, like you were saying, you know, that what is the metric of success? Is it that he's more certain that climate change is happening, or is it that he actually learned some of the science, or what, you know, what are we trying to understand? What trying to have the students understand, and to tell kind of the stories that maybe are a little bit more uncomfortable as well, right? The stories where not exactly what you hope to happen happened.
Right, and we're like, there's this assumption, I think, under much of this work that like we need to get people to understand climate change, and like environmental education has this long history of like, if only people understood environmental issues, they would change their behavior, and like it just doesn't. That's failed over and over and over again, and so people are kind of like, okay, so like now what? Like, what are the limitations of the educational project here, and how you know, towards like what are we working towards? What's the goal of our work here? I mean, I think there's an ethical goal, right? Like students are going to be dealing with this issue. There's an ethical imperative that they understand one of the largest processes that's going to shape their lives going forward. So there's a professional ethics aspect too, but. I
think that's a great question to leave us thinking about, especially as I'm sure many of us are heading into ARA in a couple of weeks. And I know we'll be presenting Tuesday, I think it's at 10, some more information about this research. So I really wanted to thank Ellie and Asla and Joseph for joining in on the panel discussion today and for letting me moderate.
Thank you, Veronica, for moderating, and Ellie, thank you so much for writing this piece.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
It's really good. I was really happy to see it in a journal like JLS, so thank you.
Well, thank you, and thank you to the JLS editors for putting this together and having us here for this discussion.
And to Lillian for doing all of the legwork. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks all.